Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to be with us for the next 2 hours today for the last CEMOTEV seminar for 2020. We have chosen to focus our last seminar for this year on the main. Okay, this seminar will focus on the main challenge the humanity had to face this year, and unfortunately it's not over. It's about the COVID pandemic, and our seminar is entitled, you have all the title here on the affiche, on the image, on the screen. So this seminar, we are happy to have two presentations of two speakers. I will present them very shortly in a short time. So the idea is to explore during our seminar the determinants of the pandemic negative outcomes, in particular the mortality rate, and also to see how many things we can learn from the policy intervention to combat this virus, in particular in terms of unintended consequences of such policies. So this seminar, this session is organized around two presentations, as I said. With the first one, I am honored to introduce to you today Robert Elliott, professor in economics at the University of Birmingham, who is an applied economist with extensive researches on topical questions linked to natural disasters, firms' behavior, and more generally the impact of globalization on the environment, with a particular interest in Chinese economy. So that's why he will present today the first lessons we could learn from a policy intervention to combat the COVID virus in China, namely, in particular, the Wuhan lockdown. So we'll start with the first presentation. We said we have about 20 minutes. That's okay. We can have some exceeded time. It's no problem. Robert, so you can start when you want, when you are ready, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalia. I shall just start sharing my screen, and thank you for the invitation. This was work, as Natalia mentioned, that looks at Wuhan. So we were interested in the impact of these lockdowns on air pollution and then on health. So this will touch on some of the themes in the next presentation as well. So we do a little back of the envelope health measures at the end, and hopefully this will be built on later. But so I've doing a lot of work on China, but also because once after Wuhan, of course, all these lockdowns were going to be anticipated or expected to some extent. So we wanted to concentrate on the first real natural experiment that was kind of the cleanest experiment in terms of capturing this impact of a lockdown on local air pollution, and then we try and give some health implications. In some sense, the headline here is that the reduction in air pollution is lower than many people think. I'm going to touch briefly on how we use machine learning and augmented synthetic control to demonstrate our results. This is work with Matt Cole and Bowen Liu, and it's part of a series of papers we're working on now, and I'll touch on some of this at the end if I have time. So I'm just going to see if I can move my screen. Okay. So the introduction, Wuhan went into COVID lockdown. Wuhan went into lockdown on the 23rd of January 2020. So it seems a long time ago now, all these events, but and these in China, a lockdown is a very serious lockdown. I know the UK and Paris have tried and done lockdowns, but they're certainly not the same experience that you'd have in China. I can tell you that. So we attempt to identify the causal impact of the lockdown on air quality levels in Wuhan. We combine these machine learning techniques, augmented synthetic control methods, to kind of give us a causal estimation. And the main results, I'll jump straight to it. we find a significant drop in NO2 and PM10, but no discernible impact on SO2 or CO. And we'll kind of hypothesize why we might find this. Back of the envelope calculations, we think the avoided deaths due to NOx reduction alone are around 496 in Wuhan. We can kind of aggregate that up to Hebei province, where Wuhan is based. And then we could aggregate us around 10,000 deaths in the whole of China. We don't want to put emphasis on the fact that these number of deaths is more than actually from the virus itself. This is not the point of the paper, but it's just to kind of give some indication of the benefits of a reduction in pollution. So the methodological motivation, why we're using machine learning and ASCM. We do a lot of work now with atmospheric science, and I know Natalia touches on this in her work. It's increasingly important, I think, that economists look at interdisciplinary methods as well to really push the science forward. We need to borrow, I think, from natural scientists as well, and this is a very good example of where we try to do this. Atmospheric science and science more general, they tend not to really care about causality, and that's the difference. So they want to identify the impact of air pollution control policies. Now, this is challenging. Air pollution concentrations are collectively affected by meteorological conditions and emission levels. Statistical analysis is also widely used in air quality trend analysis. Kind of, the scientists care about the trends. They don't really care about, the impact of a policy or why a policy is important. They have limitations in handling complicated scenarios, normality, multicollinearity, interaction effects among the explanatory variables. All of this is new, is pretty standard to economists. So these are a few of the papers, atmospheric chemical physics and science of the total environment and atmospheric chemical physics. Again, these are the kind of top journals in this field. And this is where they're using random forest normalization methods for Switzerland, and this is ones for Beijing. And the point of these science papers is to kind of control for this, for the weather. So you can imagine a city might have a number of pollutants, emissions, but if the wind is blowing very strongly, that will blow the emissions away. If the wind is blowing from other cities, the pollution levels might go up. It's also impacted by rainfall and sunlight and many other factors. So really you want to strip out these weather effects to get the true human impact of pollution. And that's what we try and do, especially if you're trying to measure the impact of a policy. So you could implement a policy, if the wind's blowing in the wrong direction from a different city, then your pollution levels go up, and it's going to really make it hard to understand the impact of the actual policy. So of the remaining challenges, improvements in air quality, it's very hard to attribute them to specific migration mitigation measures, because there's lots of policies going on at the same time, whether this is in Paris or the UK. There's clean air zones and there's restrictions on firms, and there's many different policies all interacting at the same time. What the Wuhan lockdown experiment allowed us to do is try and get a very clear, clean identification. So social science, what we care about as economists, is we care for this causal impact. Many papers now, well, the standard econometric approach is to use difference in difference, or now synthetic control method, which is just a different way of doing difference in difference. And this has the advantage of identifying the causal impact of a certain policy intervention under the context of quasi-experimental or experimental design. I was talking to one of the editors of GEAM the other day, and they're getting, he's getting hundreds of papers that are basically looking at a difference in difference treatment of a different policy in a certain country. A lot of this is in China. So a certain policy comes in, you then do these difference in difference studies, and this is pretty much a standard econometric approach. We know there's difference in difference literature is moving on very rapidly, and it's very hard to keep up. And SCM is just one variation. So our method, two methods that complement each other. We use the synthetic control to identify our causal impact. We use machine learning techniques to weather normalized to strip out the impact of weather on our emission levels. Here's a quick map. Here's Wuhan with the red star. These are our control cities, 29 control cities. Wuhan tends to be probably more highly dense. It's a little richer. It's a smaller area than some of these other cities, but otherwise it's pretty much in the range. These are the main cities in the main provinces in China. So we use hourly air quality data from the 18th of January 2013 onwards. We use this long time series to train our data. We use SO2, NO2, CO and PM10. We use 30 across 30 Chinese cities. We have hourly meteorological data. So we have temperature, relative humidity, air pressure, wind direction, wind speed. We're now supplementing this in the next work we're doing now. We're adding another 5 different weather variables, such as air pressure, cloud cover, and some other factors. We then take the hourly air pollution and meteorological data. We use these as inputs to run our weather normalization method. So we use kind of random forest-based machine learning. So this gives us our hourly de-weathered, weather normalized pollution concentrations. We then take the hourly observed weather normalized data, turn this into daily data to run our synthetic control method. To touch on the health impacts, which will lead to our mortality measures, we have nitrogen dioxide, and this mainly comes from power generation, heating, and motor vehicles. So we think the motor vehicles is going to be driving the big reduction. So Wuhan, this is in winter, in January. The heating would have still gone on. Everyone was at home, so heating wouldn't really have changed. Power generation wouldn't necessarily have changed. Difficulties are respiratory and reduced lung function. SO2 comes from burning fossil fuels, mainly power generation, domestic heating, and some from transport. PM10 is road transport. Again, a lot of it comes from the wheels and the brakes, so a lot of it's from transport. Again, respiratory difficulties, cardiovascular disease, and carbon monoxide, incomplete burning of fossil fuels, again in transport and industrial processes. Wuhan is a very industrial city. I've been there a few times, and I've been there for say a week and never seen the sun. The smog levels when I were there are extremely high, and it's literally just motorways everywhere and massively industrial. Big car industries, big steel plants, and you can imagine the pollution from these big massive plants. So machine learning, as you know, econometrics and machine learning, they're kind of the same thing. It's all learning from data. But as Afi, who's probably the real lead in this, and in Imben's state, they differ in terms of their goals, methods, and settings. Econometrics aims to identify, detect, and summarize the relationships among the data. So we might, using linear regression. We say this is model driven when we run our regressions. Do we do 3-stage least squares or some matching model, or do we for machine learning, it's simpler in many respects. It's pure prediction issue. We predict the outcome using a set of predictors, and it's purely data driven. There's no model. We don't care about non-linearities. It's not quadratics or cubics. It's simply data driven. So how do we use this in the case of Wuhan? If we take PM10 in one of these cities, for example, we have to first train the data. We train the random forest model to predict our hourly concentrations without weather. And we use this all the way back to 2014 to January 2018. Some of our predictors include the day of the week, the hour, the meteorological variables, the number of seconds since 1970. We use 80% of the data for training, 20% testing. So we call this supervised machine learning because we kind of know the outcome. So we use 80% of it to train the model, 20% to test. I'll go through this quickly, but we do this 300 times. You imagine randomly. So we take our data set and we add a random element to it. We then test that 300 times using 300 samples. We use a number of different modes, and we use a number of different terminals. This is not really important in this presentation. But what this means is we're doing this over and over again. It's like bootstrapping, and this gives us our final data set. The augmented synthetic control, as Athi says, the most important innovation in policy evaluation in the last 15 years. All your synthetic control does is create instead of your control group in a standard difference in different, you're creating an artificial control group. So instead of using a single control, we're kind of creating an average of the whole control group, and we can use different weights. And we use this to create in construct. It helps us to address the problem of non-pre-parallel trends. So if you do a standard difference in difference and you've got fantastic parallel trends, then you don't need to do synthetic control. If you don't, synthetic control can help you. There are other times when the synthetic control method does not give good parallel trends. In that case, you might want to use augmented synthetic control, which is what we do in this paper. There's no time to go into the details, but the drawback of the SCM model is it requires very high frequency data as predictors, no interference, and it can be unreliable if you don't get a good prefit. For some of the pollutants, our prefits weren't bad, but they weren't really good prefits. So we use this augmented synthetic control method, which, technically it just allows us to have some negative weights in there. And if you can do negative weights in a panel setting, it allows us to get a much better estimation. So on to the results. This is just going to show, this is the SO2, NOx, NO2, sorry, CO and PM10 for Wuhan, for the observed concentrations. So the grey lines are the other 29 cities. So it kind of says, Wuhan, you can see fairly high on NO2, towards the bottom of SO2, in the middle for CO, and pretty much in the middle for PM10. So, Wuhan's not that different from these other 29 cities. This is our weather controlled. The red line is our weather controlled version. The grey, this is just for Wuhan, is the observed. Okay, so the observed is the grey. So you can see to some extent our normalizing to control for weather conditions is kind of smoothing the data to some extent. Okay, so you're getting rid of these peaks and troughs. So it's going to give us a smoother transition. Now we look at our exact period of the lockdown. So we can only do 12 days after the lockdown, because after 12 days, other cities in China started locking down. So this is why this is a unique experiment. We had Wuhan, the only city lockdown in the world at that point. No one was talking about lockdowns. The West hardly even realized people were flying in and out and going skiing, and people were completely unaware. China locked down. After 12 days, other Chinese cities locked down, so our control group started locking down. So that's why we restrict it to this short period of 12 days for a very clean, pure estimation. And you can see again the smoothing of the data, and some in this case, our weather normalized is above the emissions. Okay, in others it's below. Okay, so this shows the impact. We then go on to our ASCM results. So you can see this is our pre-trend. So you can see how closely we get this match. So we want it at 0. So this shows that our control group and Wuhan were almost identical. Ideally, this be 0. This is very, very good fit. So we know our control group, our parallel trends are pretty good here. Then we get locked down. We get this huge fall in Wuhan of our NO2 concentrations relative to this synthetic control group of the other 29 cities, all weighted by different characteristics. So you can see again on this line here, we get this huge drop in Wuhan, and we get this straight line as you'd expect in the other 12 cities, in the other 29 cities. When we looked at SO2, you can see again very good fit, but these confidence intervals show there was a drop, but this means this grey line above 0 means there's not significant drop. And then again, recovery. And then if we look at CO and we look at PM10, there's no real CO effect, but we do get a PM10 effect, a small short-term PM effect. And I'll talk about the magnitudes later. And then as a robustness in the paper, we go through different placebo tests. We use in-time placebo tests, in-place placebo tests. So this is just a quick example of the in-time placebo test. So we just shift everything a year forward. Okay, we pretend there was a lockdown 12 months before, and there's no effect on any of the pollutants. Okay, so this gives us confidence, and we do an in-place. We randomize the city. We pretend another city had a lockdown instead of Wuhan, and again, no significance. So we can take this and then look at the health implications. Just to give you some idea, the NOx fell by around 63%. So NO2 reduction of about 63%. PM10 fell by about 35% over that 2-week period. So let's look at the mortality numbers. Previous literature has shown for the China a 10 reduction in emissions of NO2 leads to a 1.95 increase in mortality. So other studies found a 1% increase in mortality, 0.7% increase. So this is very back of the envelope. We've taken all the previous studies that have looked at the mortality impact of increases in NO2 and try and project that onto how many lives were saved in China due to the lockdowns. So we take these numbers, if even at the extreme number of 1.95%, the Wuhan reduction was 20, a reduction of 20. So given an increase of 10 led to a 1.9% increase in mortality, we can predict for Wuhan with a population of around 11 million. So you can imagine this is, bigger than Paris, bigger than London. About 496 lives, in some sense, were saved because of the lockdown. Hebei province, if we extend it to the whole province, it's around 3,000. The whole of China, around 10,000. So the conclusions, as my time is drawing to an end, our results indicate that the impact of the lockdown really varied by pollutant. And this is a nuance that newspaper reports of a kind of cleaner post-lockdown air have generally failed to acknowledge. We're doing a lot of research into understanding why. Certainly things like ozone increased quite dramatically. It's all to do with with what chemicals are interconnecting. So ironically, a fall in NO2 can increase ozone because there's a number of scientific reasons. So we find concentrations of NO2, which is closely tied to traffic volumes and fossil fuel use, fell by as much as 24 grams per m cubed. So a 63% fall. And the reduction was only 16 by the end of the 12-day period as things began to build up again. PM10 fell by over 20, but only was only short-lived. We should remember Wuhan was probably above the WHO safe levels anyway, so this lockdown just about brought Wuhan into kind of the safe level. And again, Paris, Birmingham, London are still not doing so well on these WHO records. So we find that these NO2 reductions alone may have prevented as many as 496 deaths in Wuhan itself, 3,000 in Hubei province, and around 10,000 in China as a whole. While these potential deaths may outweigh the official Chinese death toll, we're not in any way saying the pandemic has yield benefits. This is not the point of the paper. So the bigger issue, what we want to try and get across, is while a city-level lockdown may provide some clues as to what these milder forms of restrictions on human activity might do for human health. So you can imagine in Paris having congestion charging. London have brought this in. Birmingham are going to bring this in. Pedestrianised zones, urban planning more generally. London has introduced huge numbers of bicycle lanes, for example. And I know Paris has the bike sharing scheme and everything. So all of these reducing traffic in Paris, for example, you can see it could have considerable health and mortality benefits. We take the very extreme of a full lockdown, but milder versions will still have some benefits. So this is the kind of takeaway, we think. Ironically, all those London bike lanes that were introduced are kind of being removed now because there's traffic jams and people are getting very annoyed. And this is where there's going to be a struggle for policymakers. All this Green New Deal, we may have difficulties convincing people to buy this. However, the large NO2 does not suggest that policies to reduce emissions from vehicles, electrification and buses, these could have considerable health benefits. I'm doing quite a lot of work on this electric vehicle revolution at the moment, and I think this will have a big impact. Finally, final slide, just to kind of a highlight of what we're working on now. This is a recent Science Advances paper. It just kind of gives you an example of how economists are working with scientists now. And we find in this science paper that it's abrupt but smaller than expected changes in surface air quality. So we do have pollution and climate change problems. Full lockdowns have some impact, but it's probably smaller than people thought, and we really need to understand why. And it can be domestic heating and how these pollutants interact. And finally, a recently paper published in Environmental Resource Economics gives a whole list of suggestions for a COVID post-pandemic research agenda in environmental economics. And we look at green transitions, we look at pricing carbon, we look at the role of uncertainty and timing and policy interventions, and we have some issues, talk about the econometrics and some of these applied techniques. So hopefully this paper again feeds quite well into this seminar series, and I look forward to the next paper that's going to come up. Okay, thank you. Hopefully that was on time.
Thank you very much, Robert. Yes, it's okay. It's great for the time. I will invite now Stéphane Goutte, professor in economics at CEMOTEV. His research, I would say, an economist with specific skills in mathematical modeling, but also in applied economics. And his research is mainly focused on energy finance issues, but now today he will present a recent paper also on this challenging question for academicians, but also for policymakers, fighting COVID, which would be the determinants of the negative outcomes from this health crisis in order to better design the policy choices. I think so. It's about that your paper. So you have also about 20 minutes, and we'll. Sorry. I was very. No, we will first discuss the lockdowns in order to see how to further think about the policy choices we can have to face this crisis, but this health crisis, the pandemic. So about the lockdown experience first, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for this introduction. Okay, I think you hear me well. So thank you, Robert, for this great presentation. First of all, I would like to say that I know well all many parts of your publication, and it's always a pleasure to read this kind of paper, because you always combine the three parts for me of a good top publication. This means that, of course, motivation, background, the economic approach, but you go to the first part, which is the interpretation, the recommendation. So you go deeply to this kind of part of the work. And for me, today it's become the most important part for publication, to tell us how we can use your methodology, why using this kind of methodology, and how we can apply here or later. So thank you so much for this work. As Natalia said, and as you say too, you focus on the data-driven methodology, the paper, and it will be great because my paper will be more on model drivers. So it will be a good combination of thought today. Okay, so I have 4 or 5 main questions which can argument for a possible discussion. The first one is, okay, I'm ready to see that you obtain some kind of similar result by mine, because I finished the paper related to a Wuhan lockdown on impact in terms of pollution on meteorological event. And I use totally different methodology, because I use a wavelength methodology. And so wavelength is a time series approach. And one thing is very important, and I think you found exactly the same thing, is that related to a particle matter variable. We found too that there is a short-term impact first, when lockdown reduces the particle matter emission, but only in a few lengths. It's we found 3 days in 1 week, not more. And then there is a second wave of causality, where this reduction of particle matter impact reduce the infected number of people. So there is a second wave, like a second wave, more longer in 1 or 2 weeks. And it's very interesting to think to find that you found similar results with a different methodology. So my first question is, how you can explain that the impact, this impact of on particle matter is so short and don't go more longer in terms of frequency? Maybe I will stop after each question. It will be better.
Yeah, we were surprised. I mean, it's always reassuring when the results are similar, so that's it's good news. But so this is what we try to do in the Science Advances paper that I highlighted at the end. It's trying to explain why there's such a short-term impact. And I think, you know, with the sources of PM10 can be industrial. I think in the Wuhan case, they kind of, in Chinese cities, they locked down very strictly on citizens, but they really kept the factories going. So they wanted the growth to continue, or the output to continue. So the factories were still producing, and I think that the steel plants were still producing steel, and this is going to be a lot of the pollution. And that's why I think SO2 didn't change either. So it does seem to be, in all the studies I've read, it really does seem to be a NO2 transport story. And the PM10, yes, is a very short-term effect. It's still not obvious why it bounced back so quickly, but we have done other studies, and a recent study also finds this short of a policy. So Chinese government has a policy where they send whole teams of inspectors into different cities, and the city never knows when they're going to come. And we just see they come in, PM10 falls for a week, inspectors leave, and it goes straight back up. I mean, so there really is this, as soon as the inspectors disappear, things go back to normal. So even in the lockdown, I suspect a lot of things were going on that maybe should not have gone on. So, but the science behind the PM10 is, yes, it's still not obvious to me. That's why we need to work with scientists to really understand the chemistry that's going on here, I think.
Thank you. My second question is, okay, we saw on the publication that lockdown has been clearly air quality improving, okay? But one point for me is that this lockdown can, of course, interact and maybe dominate the effect of pollution variable against COVID-19 telephone case. So how you can think that we can manage this kind of domination of lockdown, because there is some mutualization of effect.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, there are some studies that are looking at individual policies in London, the congestion charge, and some of these. And the difficulty with a lot of these papers is there's so many different policies going on at the same time. It's just very hard to disentangle them. This is why we concentrated on just one city and one policy for 2 weeks, because it's very hard otherwise to extend it to anything else. But we're going to try and do this for other policies in the clean air zones in the UK, where different cities pick them up. But again, it's just hard for the identification is difficult.
Yes. And one of the questions is that you found, like me, in fact, that humidity variable is not significant. But for me, it's quite difficult to understand, because in other kind of virus, humidity factor is always significant in terms of contagion. And why? I don't know why. For COVID-19, humidity variable never become significant. I don't know why. Not solution I saw and I read always is not significant. So I think it's a true solution, but why?
Yeah, it's true. I'm not sure. Yeah. So my colleague Matt Cole has a paper in the same issue with looking at the Dutch data. They find some strange. They look at health impacts, and they find some strange results. They do find rural. They look at the COVID cases and pollution, and they really find a significant effect. So, whether this is due to the weather, but there is some clearly evidence that pollution levels increase transmission. Now, whether that's droplets on the PM10 and we breathe in the PM10, but they find a big rural effect in the Netherlands, and they're really linking this to animal farming and the ammonia that's used in chicken farms. And you just don't realize Netherlands has such a massive kind of factory farm issue. So they find higher transmission rates in rural regions. And I think this is all to do with the ammonia pollution from farms and stuff. We think it's all in cities, but there's a big rural effect as well. So, there really are the impact of pollution on transmission rates is also a very interesting area. I think that's useful to look at.
Yes. And maybe my last question is I try to introduce the interest of a lockdown, ecological lockdown. This means that a lockdown to reduce the carbon emission. But in your result in mine too, we found that the effect in carbon emission is not very significant. Okay, there is particle matter, there is azote, but no in carbon. And so we clearly see that there is a health benefit of lockdown. But I think it would be interesting, or I don't know how, but to deal with this possible ecological lockdown effect, to preserve the earth and not the earth only. So it's difficult to measure or to have significant result, but I think we can maybe with more data, with more comparison, investigating this kind of longer benefit. So yeah. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think certainly, some of this research, the research my colleague did as well, got a lot of kind of publicity, and I think governments are realizing that if they do reduce transport within cities, there can be very strong health benefits long term. And whether that's more science, and this is all part of the European Green Deal, I think, which is going to be pushed forward. If we can use this as a catalyst for kind of a Green New Deal, and whether that's more cycle lanes and more congestion charges, and we know Paris has tried to do some of this, and it's led to protests, and people don't like necessarily restrictions on using cars and so forth. But this has given us an example to show the health benefits of reducing inner city pollution. And they're much bigger, I think. And all the studies are showing the health benefits of reducing pollution are much bigger than people thought. And this kind of this COVID's given us an experiment to kind of give us some idea on how big those benefits are going to be. So I think the public are going to be more supportive of these policies. But if we are going to enter into a major recessionary period in Europe, certainly in the UK with everything that's going on here, environmental aspects often take a second when people actually want jobs in the first place. So it's going to be difficult. It's a unique opportunity, but the economics may be against us at the moment.
Thank you, Robert. I will let the talk for the people. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much. We will take a couple of additional questions from our auditory. We have one question already in the chat. Auguste, according to your projection, the lockdown has saved only 11,000 lives for the whole China. Is it very disappointing as a result, given that the lockdown is the extreme measure to fight pollution?
I think that's a good question. You've got to remember these lockdowns were only for a couple of weeks. These are only very short period lockdowns. So 10,000 lives over such a short period. I mean, if you were to do a permanent lockdown, of course, the benefits would be much greater. So I think given how short the lockdown period was, this is still a fair number of lives. Of course, China had a very limited number. Official numbers suggest that this is still more than the deaths from COVID in China. I mean, Europe's having these numbers on the daily. UK, France, hitting 400 or 500 a day. We're way above this number. But China was very severe in their lockdowns and very severe in their control. Anyone who's got, and I've got Chinese PhD students, travel to China is very difficult. You have to go into a two-week quarantine where you land, and then another 2-week quarantine in the city you move to. So it's extremely strict. So is 11,000 over 2 weeks? It seems, I think, I don't know if it's disappointing. It seems about right given the time period, I think.
Yes. Do you have other questions? If there are no questions in the, let's say, outside my screen, maybe we'll. You have a question?
You need a question or not?
Yes, but I don't see you. You can.
I don't like to be the guy going in the bank. Yes, it's more simple for me just to come here to ask my question. My question is about the way you made the calculus of the number of dead people, the impact. From my experience, as I was years ago working on the social cost of drugs, legal and illegal, the way to make the calculus is a long-term consumption to explain the number of days. If you just stop to smoke for 2 weeks or even for 3 months, you don't have any impact on the way you will have a concern. So I don't understand how you can calculate the number of days if you just have a lockdown of 2 weeks, even for 3 months. In general, as health people explain, you don't have any impact if you stop to breathe pollution just for 3 weeks or 1 month. So I'm not very comfortable in the way you find 5 or 6,000 of people will be saved. Can you just explain this history of the short-term consumption of pollution air and the long-term pollution consumption of the pollution air?
Yes. So yeah, so we're very clear at the start. This is a very back of the envelope calculation. So all we did in this case was to take the existing estimates from 5 or 6 other papers that have looked at the mortality impact of increases in NO2, and we just kind of took their estimates and applied it to the population. So we let those papers in some sense do the science behind this. But of course, I mean, talking to health economists, this is very complicated, and of course there's long-term impacts, and people, a lot of this may just be slowing down deaths that would happen anyway, and there's all these issues related to harvesting effects and so forth. So I think you're right to be concerned, and you're right to question this. We just took the existing scientific estimates and did some very rough calculations, and they fit with these other estimates, given that, because the key of the short period is we got this big 63% reduction in NO2, but within weeks of the lockdown finishing, it was back up to normal levels again. So there really is this gap. of that reduction. And I think there was some nice papers that looked at Paris on there, say, look, Paris had a strike in the steel industry, and NO and their pollution levels went down, and they estimate the health impacts of that strike on the health benefits in residents around in Paris, for example. So there's a precedent for looking at these short-term impacts. But I agree, it's very back of the envelope and kind of waving hands about estimates. So this is why we kind of tag it on at the end. We have another project that's going to try and do this properly, but as you've explained, there's a lot of difficulties in actually measuring the health effects, and then you get into issues to do with value of statistical life and so forth that can complicate things even further. But as economists, we want to try and put values on lives saved and so forth, and because these numbers are looking pretty big, depending on the value you put on a life, this is really pushing policymakers to take this more seriously, and we hope that these sort of estimates will give us some idea of what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, we have another question. Christoph, in your experience, either from a personal point of view or if you have seen it happen already, the COVID situation and the drop in pollution in areas around the world, will it help pushing the agenda of changing and adapting policies for the protection of the environment? Yes,
I mean, this is the big question, really. I know policymakers are very interested in this research. They're very interested in some of these results. It really has brought home the environmental benefits of reducing at least traffic pollution. So they're very keen to do this. It has pushed up the agenda, and this is why a lot of countries, the UK, Boris Johnson announced this, it's going to be they're talking about, a green stimulus plan. It's a green recovery. It's a green transition. The European Union is pumping billions in at some point, if they can get it past the Hungarians and the Polish, and these huge benefits, they want to push a green agenda. This is green jobs, this is clean jobs, it's green tech, it's clean tech. All of this is being pushed on the policy side. My big fear, of course, is that the whole of Europe, France and the UK, the economy is really going to struggle next year. I think it's going to be hard, given the money printing and the debts. I mean, this is for a macro lecture, but the debt levels are have to be paid back at some point. So I worry that once recession kicks in, governments are just going to care about jobs and getting growth back. So it is at the front of the agenda, but I fear it's going to fall back once the economy starts to really experience the hangover from this stimulus that's all going on now. So that's my fear. So economists tend to be pessimistic on balance. I like to be optimistic. It's pushed the environment right to the front. Yeah. But economic reality is going to kick in. I fear.
Yes.
So this is a big message.
Thank you. Just in the same line of this question, indeed, your results indicate us that we can have significant impacts of policy action, and as you have shown for the air quality, I think indeed it can change and maybe push our political agenda to fight to protect the environment. But what about the climate change fight? The fight with climate change, it's a little bit different from the environmental quality. And I am afraid that the results like yours maybe could, disappoint some people who is really thinking about the scale of economies and reducing the scale of economies in order to have lesser greenhouse gas emissions. So this natural experience shows us that finally, even brutally reducing our economy scale, the greenhouse gas emissions are still there. So this is a little bit disappointing. Should we maybe first focus on climate change adaptation and let behind the mitigation? No, it's not my point of view, just a question. I don't know.
It's It's hard to be too optimistic here. That's the I agree that these are extreme measures, and the effect was short term and not that impressive. And if we talk about CO2 emissions, I work on China a lot, and they're still building, coal-fired power stations in India and China all the time. They're really pushing renewables, but they're still highly reliant on coal. Coal is very polluting. The whole climate, it has brought climate change to the fore, and we hope that John Kerry as the US advisor on climate change, this may help. But I do fear that economic recessions are going to again put climate change back on the back foot. So it is hard to be optimistic, and we'll probably discuss this later on the globalization and the environment and how we should deal with this. But it was only a year ago, or the climate, the Paris Agreement was not so long ago. The anniversary was a week ago or so. That could have been more ambitious as well, and it's going to be very hard to hit those 1.5 targets, that's for sure. So it's hard to be overly optimistic, unfortunately.
Just my last question is very quickly on maybe in the technical terms. As for CO and so the greenhouse gases, I don't know if you've taken into consideration the fact that there are some differences in terms of observation of different pollutants. As I could understand, for example, it takes time for PM10 to be observed, whereas it takes time for CO to be dissipated. So there is some disequilibrium, how to say that, in the timing of observations. There could be delayed effects in taking measures of these data. Maybe this specific nature of CO is a kind of explanation that 12 days is not sufficient because we have really the delay in dissipation. So maybe it was after the end of January that the impacts were really seen, but it wasn't covered in your period of.
Yeah, we did extend the period out. As I said, we stopped at 12 days because all the other cities, the control group started getting their lockdowns, so the comparison wasn't very good. But unfortunately, the evidence still, when we look at just the numbers, it really was, the bounce back happened pretty quickly in all these pollutants. In some cases they increased. So I understand the point, but there didn't seem to be a longer term effect. It really was short term.
Yes, maybe I can complete your reply. In the paper about my theory on Wuhan with wave methodology, we have a more long time period, but for carbon, nothing short, nothing. Even we took data until middle of April, so we were a lot more lag in terms of impact, but nothing became because
of the greenhouse gas effects, and carbon is still increasing.
On the short term.
Okay, thank you. Vincent, you had a question I needed to.
My question. Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Elliott, which is very interesting. The search for hard evidence about the impact of the lockdown. I'm sorry for that. I have quite a general question about the possibility to transpose the results obtained in Wuhan on other contexts on countries.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have to remember that that Wuhan was already, the pollution levels were already way above WHO safe levels. So in some sense, this brought them down into the safe levels. but it was always already a very polluting place. So if you think of some of the European cities, we were already fairly safe, and we become even safer. So the health benefits may not be so strong elsewhere, but certainly Birmingham and Paris, again, and London don't do that well on these scores either, actually. So the health benefits in Paris and London and Birmingham would still be quite significant, I think, because of that pretty high pollution levels. But they're still not as high as where they were in Wuhan before, and many of these Chinese cities, which are very highly polluted, certainly in comparison with, Stockholm and some, Copenhagen and many other European cities. So then the health benefits would not be so great, but this previous literature still looks at the impact of a 10% increase or a 10% decrease. So maybe the bench line doesn't matter that much. So it may be that we can take these numbers across. I'm not a health economist, but if it is just a linear effect, then a 10% reduction is a 10% reduction and should have health benefits anyway. I can't help but think there must be some non-linear effect when you've got really high, very unhealthy air. There may be other benefits. So, but yeah, it's a good point on how to generalize these health benefits, especially.
Well, this is a question that we have encountered, and it's very debated in development economics. In fact, the possibility to transpose the results from obtained on a very contextual methods to more general other contexts, and it doesn't work very well, in fact.
Yeah. So quality of healthcare and national and per capita income and all these things are very important. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much once again, Robert, for this excellent presentation. And we can go back to some discussion at the end if I hope we will have some time to make a general discussion. But before that, Stefan will present his own research on COVID-19 with an alternative empirical method, and maybe we will see with alternative results.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So I will not present my paper related to China, because to combine your presentation with the other one, I focus more on model driven related to a COVID-19 effect. So I would like to present you a paper we finished it just last week about the macroeconomic determinant of COVID-19 mortality rate, curse or blessing. So it's an open question, and I will propose you some methodology to investigate this kind of issue. It's a joint paper with Professor Olivier Damet from University of Lyon and Professor Cédric Porcher from Paris 1. So the main motivation is to investigate the empirical driver of COVID-19 in a cross-country mortality rate at a macroeconomic level. Okay, and for this we built a cross-sectional data set with 69 countries from different sectors, so about with different kind of variable. So demographic variable, health and development infrastructure, economic development, pollution, tourism flow, and some original data about control and restriction policies, such as school closing, surveillance, travel restrictions. So the aim is to deal with possible variables which can affect the COVID-19 situation on how they affect in terms of positivity or negativity effect. And we hope that our results will be informative for policymakers to better calibrate future on policy and reduce the spread of the virus, of course. So, okay, this is quite motivation, but Robert already talk about this, so maybe I will switch this slide to go quicker to the main result. But my point is can we explain the cross-country differences about mortality rate by some social macroeconomic factor, or by the different public policy conducted by the governments during the pandemic crisis and even before. So, okay, general investigation about macroeconomic variable and possible variable to explain the spread appears in different countries around the world. Okay, so which kind of variable, if I would like to be more specific? So we will, different variable would be to the fatality ratio. So the COVID-19 death normalized with the population. And we would like to extend it with some health variable, okay, like a number of hospital beds, number of physicians. So does it mean that a country with more health structure are less impacted by COVID-19 situation or not? We try to investigate with public policy related to health on GDP, so like health expenditure of GDP and in level and growth rate. We include some demographic variable, so the ratio of people over 65 years old, because all discussion and publication try to say that if we are elder, but we are more impacted by COVID-19. We add some population density to try to measure if it has an impact or not. Of course, we added some environmental and air variable, like CO2 emission. And at the end, as I told you, we add some original data about some control strategy to try to investigate if travel or schooling restriction on government effectiveness or surveillance policy have a real impact or increase the possible impact of the variable. So we would like to investigate this kind. Of course, there is a lot of variable we can add of this kind of model, but we have clearly to make some restriction. But we think that this set of variable is quite complete for first investigation of cross-country comparison. Yes, just to give some highlight about the where data was collected. I can share after the working paper, okay, to everybody to have more information about the data. Okay, so the first step of methodology is to use some simple ordinary Vesper estimation, okay, about several equation, and so we add all the part of variable. We test several equation with adding one part of possible variable, and of course at the end variable which should be highlighted as significant if it's significant for every kind of every equation. So let's talk about result. If I put in green some positive effect and in red some negative effect, okay, to be highlighted easily for everybody. So if you look at this kind of result, we can see that health variable are significant driver of fatality rate and are expected sign, okay? Country with high number of hospitality beds on physicians are probably better armed to fight the virus. Okay, if you look here for hospitality beds, okay, we clearly see that for all possible regression, it's significant. And so it's confirmed the fact that, okay, a country with health infrastructure, developed health infrastructure, have a better chance to reduce the impact of COVID-19 situation. We found too, we confirmed too that, of course, age structure of population and the proportion of elder people is a very important predictor of mortality rate ratio and larger driver in a negative way. Okay, for all situations, all regression, we have a positive value. So the proportion of all people in the country increase the mortality, and so the mortality ratio of the situation. So this confirms a lot of already accepted and published in paper about this kind of variable. So, okay, nothing new in terms of a conclusion at the end, just to confirm that we obtained some classical and some already obtained results. But if you look at no more specific variable, okay, if you look at the number of tourist arrivals in the country, so it's here, okay, we look that it's not significant for all possible regression. It's only significant for the one of the three. So it means that okay, maybe there is some significant positivity impact of number of tourist arrivals. So a country with a higher number of tourists is probably likely to host some infected people. Also maybe it's generated some patient zero. Okay. And then cluster area. So this kind of result could be investigated later for small countries, small islands, which are closed at the beginning, and maybe if they don't close the frontier, then COVID-19 will arrive. Okay, but it's not significant for all possible regression. So it's a small significant impact in terms of our investigation. And if we look at CO2 and carbon emission, okay, carbon pollution variable, so the CO2 emission growth rate has a positively related fatality COVID-19 impact. So we found that, okay, the bad situation in terms of pollution variables, so the bad environment, increase the fatality ratio of COVID-19 case. So in countries which the air is of poor quality with bad emission of CO2 or is NO2, okay, on our passport we might weaken vulnerable people. Okay, so as Robert talked as my previous already paper, okay, we found that pollution and environmental variable could have an impact. And CO2 emission are positivity impact for all regression, for all possible equations. So it confirms the negative impact in terms of fatality rate, COVID-19 fatality rate from all 69 countries. Okay, one thing interesting, I think it's not that it's the cross-immunity effect. If we cross with tuberculosis exposure, and so it's BCG coverage here, and we found significant negative coefficient that confirms some previous first result obtained by Scoban in 2019, but this variable is very robust to different model of estimation, okay? And so the link between tuberculosis vaccine on COVID-19 virus should be more investigated. So there is cross immunity. And this result suggests that, okay, we have to go deeply for better investigation about this cross effect, because this variable, it's, as I told you, it's robust for all different models estimated. And we obtain something after, for example, the overweight, again, classical variable from common discussion that affect positively the COVID-19 situation. And we found too that for two models of the four that it's a positivity impact. So we found a huge result about the COVID-19 fatality effect. Okay, so the second step was to investigate some control policy variable, are they efficient or not? So for this, we had some travel testing, surveillance school variable, and then we try to measure the impact of education on this kind of variable, or the impact of our government effectiveness on this kind of variable. To measure if the high education people in the country have increased or reduced the possible effect of schooling on restriction on testing control. So we did not find any significant effect for public testing policy on travel restriction, whatever the specification testing. Travel restriction seems to have no effect on mortality rate, okay? So here, testing on travel seems not have any significant effect in our database, of course. But public testing policy based on an example of tracing using digital tools are likely to be efficient to prevent transmission and reducing the spread of disease, but maybe too weak to significantly decrease the number of fatality. Okay, so this is a possible explanation about this result. But something interesting is that we found that an evidence that surveillance and school closure variable are negatively associated with the fatality ratio. And both control policy have significantly reduced the severity of the pandemic in countries where the policy have been implemented. So travel restriction, testing restriction, not really significant, but surveillance and school closure have clearly a negative effect for both method, for both estimation. And now, if we look if the high education situation increase or not this effect of school closure, for example, we saw that the level of education can influence the efficiency of control policy. Why? Because more the factor of education on school here is always negative. This means that the product close education have a clearly impact the school closure effect. So a better level of education of the population is likely to exacerbate the negative effect of surveillance policy on the fatality rate. So it's clearly, I think it's the first result that I saw. I didn't see any other publication who measure that the fact that okay in a country with high level of public education, the impact of the COVID-19 is less than in other situations. So educated people are better candidate to front to the pandemic situation, to reduce the situation. And the same result also when government effectiveness variable is used. So it's always a proof for me that for Chinese country or Korean country where we observe that the situation is better than the other country, that people are more educated and governments are more strong in terms of application, but they reduce the fatality ratio is negative, is reduced more than in other countries. So the situation that we think that, okay, for example, for French or for Germany or in England, people are not really strict or not really conscious by the situation and don't do the good thing or don't follow the government directive. Okay, but we prove that in this kind of modeling that okay, it's the right thing. Okay, government have to be strong. And the impact would be good at the end to reduce the fatality and the effect of COVID-19 on the population. Okay, it's a good point. Maybe we have to be in some of architecture to be less impacted by COVID-19. That's a joke, of course, but it could be a good impact for this kind of situation. Okay. Just a few words about, because in this working paper we investigated a second methodology to deal with this possible driver variable, and we propose to use Bayesian moving average method. So this methodology is just to combine all possible cross variable in the situation. So we put all variable, okay, and they test all possible pair of variable if this variable is significant or not. And then, after all, they order the possible variable in terms of percentage of significance for be simple, okay? And which result we obtain here is that for with all variable, the BMA methodology tests more than 1,500 model, and it appears that in 97% of the regression case, 4 variables are always significant. And for example, here we found that the openness of tutorismus, the share of people older than 65 years old, the number of hospital beds, and the cumulative number of infected people okay, are always significant for more than 97% of the regression. So it's clearly variable which are driver of COVID-19 mortality rate. And we, of course, obtain the expected sign of negative effect of tourism, openness, and age of people on cumulative case, but a positive effect of hospitality bed, the number of hospital bed for 100,000 people. So after, of course, we obtain some other significant driver, but less of all, in this kind of methodology, people think that we have to be more than 50% significant for all models to be significant at the end. But for me, the conclusion is, okay, if you like really to focus on driver, okay, you have to select 90% of driver variable. Okay, for me, it's my point of view, okay, to be statistical, have a statistical effect. So this is the second part to check the possible effect of variable. Okay, here's one we have skip this slide, okay, just to say that, okay, there's always some possible variable. Okay, so just to conclude, okay, and to have discussion together, we found that, okay, structural determinant of such as the demographic, openness to visitor, health infrastructure, cross-site immunity, and the dynamic of bonding are more or less significant drivers of death ratio, okay, across country. And air quality, and more importantly, some of the containment strategies seem to have played only a minor role. From schools closure and surveillance control policies seem to have slowed down the epidemic dynamics. So we hope that this kind of conclusion open the possible investigation in some specific country or specific government policy. And okay, it's an open investigation, but I hope it replies of many questions of research and medicine. So thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. You can stop sharing the screen. So now Vincent Jérémy will proceed our discussions. First, some feedback on the presented paper by Stéphane, and by opening discussion widely with all the people present here. So here and there.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you, Stéphane, for the presentation of the paper. I have a lot of things, and I found many interesting tracks for future research in your paper. Do I have the right to begin by a general comment before going?
You have also a right to.
Okay. Thank you, Natalia. So my main comment on the Stéphane Good paper would be the same than the one I would make about the Robert Elliott paper. Simply, we need more. We need more. We need more research. We need more research trying to establish hard evidence on the determinants, like the paper presented by Stéphane, on consequences of the COVID. But also we need, I think, more deepened research through case studies and pluridisciplinary analysis in order to tackle a very high level of uncertainty. If I may quote Olivier Favreau, who wrote once that l'incomplétude n'est pas le problème, mais la solution, which I may translate as certainty is not a problem, but a solution, meaning that once uncertainty is taken into account, institutions can exist and can be integrated in our analysis. This is, by the way, the very orientation of our research program on the role of institutions and policies in the resilience of small island economies, the polymer research program. Concerning, I will keep at a very general level, and after I will ask some more precise questions to Stefan. Concerning the search for hard evidence, well, hard evidence is pretty hard to obtain, I would say. Need a very important data set, and maybe sometimes results can appear to be a little bit disappointing. And maybe more disappointing when it comes to understand and think some unprecedented shock like the COVID outbreak. If I may quote our French Nobel Prize Esther Duflo, the way out of wishy-washy evidence is very tricky and uncertain again. For me, the uncertainty is maybe what we have learned from the COVID outbreak, showing that we do live in a very uncertain world. This is a feature well known by economists dealing with highly vulnerable economies, like small islands economies, territories, and households. What a subject, thematics that we do know well at the CEMOTEV Research Center. For itself, the COVID outbreak was by nature deeply unanticipated for policymakers as well as for citizens. It was a real surprise, a bad surprise, but as quoted by Robert Elliott, with some silver lining by its decreasing impact on pollution, at least in the very short run. On a longer term perspective, the question arises about the game-changing nature of the COVID as a shock. And this question is still open today, and this is why we will need more and more research on this topic out of the very short-term perspective. I will turn next to more precisely to the paper presented by Stefan, which is the first step in the analysis of macroeconomic determinants of the impact of COVID, impact of these macroeconomic determinants on the COVID fatality. What do we learn from the Stefan Good analysis? Well, in fact, that uncertainty is very high. 4 variables seems to have constantly a very significant impact in the explanation of the fatality rate. I want okay. But on the policy side, very few variables appear to play a significant role. And this is, for me, quite surprising. The mobilization, the use of the database of Porsche, which I warmly recommend to every researcher on the COVID subject, is very valuable. And I would have expected some more significant results of the variable on the policy measures following the COVID, but unfortunately, it appears that it is not really the case. So I have, well, 3 questions. The first one is, how do you explain the fact that on the policy side, the variable travel restriction is not significant or weakly significant? The tourism arrival is a variable highly significant in every model you test, if I'm right. And I wonder if this is a result of a statistical artifact due to the construction of data, or if you have another explanation to this apparently contradictory result. The second question is about pollution. The CO2 variable of pollution, well, on considering the bibliography on the previous articles, carbon dioxide does not appear to be a strong determinant of fatalities, at least not in the short run or even in the medium run. Would it be possible, I'm sure you have considered this possibility, but do you think it would be possible to consider the nitrogen dioxide pollutant in your model? Eventually, on last question, general comment on the absence of true macroeconomic variables. In fact, macroeconomic determinants, the variables that appear to be significant is the explanation of COVID fatalities, are not so much macroeconomic, they are rather national or country level variable. I would expect, and I'm sure you have tried and you have considered that, of course, that, for example, income, variable of income, debt, human capital, current account balance, but also specialization, tourism, for example, tourism specialization, and inequality would have been perhaps significant in your regressions. As I know, you have worked on the Sandy case, which is very specific, for which you have found that socioeconomic factors are more, how to say that, overcome other health and structural factors to explain the incidence of COVID, high incidence in COVID of Sandy. I would have expected that you had taken into account in this regression the results you have found in the Sandy case. I stop here because I have no.
Thank you very much. So you answer the last questions before taking because we have some additional questions in the chat. You can write your questions in the chat. We will take them.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Vincent, for all these comments and questions. Okay. First of all, to be more general reply, and time focus on your question. In this paper, okay, I will try to. In this paper, we focus on 69 countries, and the time date it's 7 July. So it's a specific for the first wave, okay, and we take into account countries. I will share you the paper, okay, at the end to have the list of 69 countries. We focus on the country where we, of course, observe a significant mortality rate, okay? Because if we would like to investigate the driver of mortality rate, we have to have some data, okay? And this is the main point to be careful about publication and paper you saw about the COVID-19 effect, because we researcher here review on some paper where people just try to do some investigation related to COVID-19 to publish very quickly. And at the end, the consistent, the significance, and the interest of this kind of publication is very less. It's very bad. It's a very bad publication, in fact. So having a good publication takes time, and we have to have some enough control and take time and variable to have consistent and significant results. So be careful about it. now, if I look about the two variables about tourism, okay, and the opposite effect, of the effect that one is significant and the other one not. For the travel restriction variable, I show you that travel restriction is not significant for both of them. And one explanation about it is that since we focus on this policy of travel restriction appears later than the beginning of the fatality of COVID-19. So the effect of this variable are not really impacted because the situation was already present in this country. So closing the openness of tourism after 1 or 2 months is too late. So maybe we'll have to have other data set to test this kind of variable. But if we look at the openness is more interesting because it's significant and positive. Because openness means that okay, a country, because we take openness, we take an indicator about 2018 openness. So it means that a country which we know that it's an open country has better results in terms of fatality and COVID-19 situation than a closed country. So it means that an open country for tourism, for industry, for economy is it's a bad candidate or has worst result faced with COVID-19. That's my expectation. That's why there is one significant and one not significant. So it depends on the situation on the investigation. It's okay.
Yes, I have. In fact, I have not seen a clear definition of the variable openness.
Yes.
That's why I have this question.
Yes, of course. In this paper, maybe I will share I will share you the document to be perfect. After regarding the so all the question about CO carbon pollution, okay, it's like the discussion with Robert previously. It means that there's too few direction on. It's quite difficult to investigate ecological or environmental variable, short-term effect, long-term effect, and in this database we are in cross-sectional studies. So there is no time dependency. So if you look this time, since we focus on 7 July data, with country already impacted by COVID-19, the most part of this country are developing country. Developing country means CO2 emission, high level of CO2 emission, and so that's why maybe we can have a positive impact. It could be interesting now with the second wave with more data to deal with the subgroup of developing country, with one with CO2 high level of CO2 emission by environment, and see if results change. And it could be a comparison or a business check to see if it's always the case in our situation. So that's why it could be a bias of this variable, but we highlight it in the paper to be careful about result in terms of pollution and environmental issues.
Maybe yes. Just about this point, make a difference between greenhouse gases and local pollution, which are different in terms of impact on the health.
Yes.
So, I think,
yes, of course. And your last question about including the hydrogen variable. Yes, of course. Of course, we can add other kind of hydrogen variable specific. You know that I like all energy sector, so of course it's interesting for me. The main point is to have access to data for all the country. Okay.
Okay, so you don't have access to this data.
Not this data already. You mentioned that Simon Pachelman on my author has built very impressive database. Okay. And now I have access to last version, okay, not official live versions. We can investigate to apply some time dependencies results. So not focus only on processing of data, so to have time dependencies, and we have more data, more experiences, more historical region. So we can include new small country like small island for all of our projects. We can have every country adding on this paper. Okay. So it opened the possibility to validate this preliminary result or to add more to investigation. So okay, we can do of course more, but I think this paper, it's already interesting because, as you told me, I see this paper as a openness discussion, openness paper, because okay, methodologically in terms of statistics, it's very basic. It's a simple paper. Okay, I'm a mathematician. I can use AV methodology, but we have a simple study. Okay, about just quantitative data, OLS regression, Bayesian modeling averaging. Okay. We saw some possible investigations, some possible interesting result on. Okay, I think it's a good perspective paper.
Yes, of course. Thank you. I will take questions in the order of arrival. So we had Auguste with a question. Your database contains 69 countries. I imagine that among them are some sub-Saharan African countries. You know that the World Health Organization announced at the beginning of the pandemic the worst scenario for these countries. Sorry, Auguste, I'm adding some words. We haven't observed the apocalypse announced yet. What does your research tell us about the puzzle? Okay, so this is a good question because okay, there is some sub-Saharan African countries in our study. For example, if I remember Guinea, Cameroon, Congo. So there is some African and sub-African countries. And one thing I think is that okay, since we see that health policy have a significant impact. So of course, for this kind of, for example, the number of beds in hospital, we can of course see imagine that for this kind of country. The effect will be worse, of course. But since our study stopped in 7 July, it's difficult to measure this kind of result. But today, I think it's possible regarding the new data. There is a new data, and with this kind of methodology, we can have a subgroup control of country regarding the specific variable against about infrastructure in terms of health infrastructure or health policy. And I think we will obtain that for this kind of country a result of worse face to a pandemic situation. Can you control for geography in your? Yes. You didn't have anything so in the paper. No, in this paper we didn't do it. But I think, of course, we can do it for the future investigation. But as I told you, the most part of the 69 countries in this investigation are developed countries, so more in North Hemisphere, or also in Europe and quite part in Asia, but less in Africa and South America. Less in Equatorian countries. Yes, of course. Michael Goujon, what about the selection process of the sample of 69 countries? As I told you, it's a country where we have fertility ratio significant. So which case? We have to have case. Robert also said that it would be good to see some marginal effects. How many lives are saved based on the coefficients estimated? Yes, of course. When I read the paper, it was one of my investigations. How I can use the methodology to do it. So maybe if you want, you can work with me. You can work with me and do your methodology and my database. It would be great. But yes, it's another marginal effect, which will be very great to investigate. Evaluate it, okay. And another question Robert wrote here. Population being negative, so you have a negative... yes. Negative, okay. Not so always significant as in one of the paper of Robert too. I think you are also a co-author of this paper. Yes, no? You're not? Okay, so in a recent paper for Netherlands, it was shown that they had no significant index for population. What do you think about that?
Yeah, population density. Yeah, I think people think population density should be negative, should be positive, but I think you find it negative. It's just hard to explain.
Yes, you're right. Population density may have be a factor of increasing contagion. Okay, and here a negative impact we found a negative impact. However, think that in a cross-country data set, population density indicates whether a country is rural or urban, because we are in cross-sectional. We don't. So in our case, this negative effect can result from the fact that population density partially capture difference in economic development. Okay, because we finally prefer this in this paper to keep the urban percentage variable. Okay, I think cross density population is not very statistically interesting in terms of cross-sectional point of view. That's why. So that's why in the paper, in this presentation, I don't really argue this kind of variable because I'm not convinced about the use of this kind of variable in a cross-sectional point of view.
It's a really interesting result to focus on why population density could reduce fatality. Yes. It's very interesting.
But I advanced on told. I published a paper related to specific case in France, in Ile-de-France. Okay. For Robert, if you are not French people, if you look at the region of Ile-de-France, okay, there is a small department which is Seine-Saint-Denis, which is a poor department with high density population, with people who have low level of works and of education. And we show that this kind of population are more impacted by COVID-19 situation. So clearly, density of population. If you have a small house with a lot of children, if you have a small income in terms of salary, okay, you are more impacted. Okay, so a surmortality factor is clearly impacted by social and economic variable, and density is one of them. Okay, if you have, we saw, for example, in Paris that just before the first lockdown, I think the number, I'm not sure, but around 20% of people living in Paris go to a secondary house in rural province. So they are lucky. They are lucky because they can skip the pandemic situation. But in Seine-Saint-Denis, people don't have it. They don't have the chance. They have to work. We can't work at home because they don't have the job specification to work at home. They are workers to clean the house, to clean the city. So there is a combination, a superposition of bad indicator for this kind of population. And now I have a working paper dealing with the same cases from New York City, related to Manhattan people on Bronx and Queens situation. And we found clearly the same situation, but Manhattan people are safe than Bronx and Queens people. But because there is the same economic and social situation.
And can I ask you, Robert, please? Sorry, I I haven't read the paper of Coletol 2020. Did they, I suppose, control for income, social exclusions, socio-economic factors, and they still find that population density is negative, even by controlling all of them, all of these factors? Did they control for lockdowns experiences? Maybe, I don't know, maybe high density countries have experienced more stringent policy interventions, and that's why maybe they have a negative outcome for this variable. I don't know, just.
Yeah, I think it was within one country, so it's just within the Netherlands, and they looked at other factors such as there was some kind of rural fair, like a. That used to go on where people would gather, for example. So they're trying to control for all these different factors, and they still found that the health impacts were worse in the rural areas. And I mentioned that before, whether it was linked to intensive farming. So this is why the publicity was interesting, because this is showing that intensive animal farming might be contributing, and they couldn't control for that. But it still was a strange result that you'd expect densely populated cities to be more badly affected, and it wasn't. But it could be specific to the Netherlands structure, which is why it's useful to do these bigger cross-sectional studies as well. But that's why I was surprised to see this result. So it's interesting.
Yes, thank you. So I will go further for the questions. Marc Leandri, thanks for the presentation. Just a clarification question. Could you recall what variable you used for tuberculosis exposure? If it's the rate of vaccination, isn't there a bias caused by the fact that most rich countries no longer have compulsory vaccine against tuberculosis unless you belong to a special group?
Yes. Okay. From tuberculosis exposure, it's measured by the percentage of population covered by vaccine, by BCG vaccine. So, okay, it could be a bias with developing countries, but since in our data, we focus at the end. The main part of country are related to a developed country. There is not more bias about it. So after, if you look in a subgroup, for example, if you talk about Ile-de-France, maybe we obtain some differences. But in a national vision, I think it's okay statistically.
Okay, for variables, we have a next variable about the government effectiveness, how it is measured.
Yes.
It should be the Kaufman, no? Kaufman and Taylor.
Yes. Yes.
No?
I don't remember.
Government single.
Yes, I think it's government index given by
World Bank?
Yeah, given by the World Bank, exactly. The World Bank variable.
And have you tested or taken into account the impact of population density or urbanization, depending on the countries identified? So we can discuss the population density. I have the same question as okay.
Just at the end, I will send you the paper with all data, source of data variable to explain you to have more information. And you will see that there is a test to robustness check with percentage count number. So there is a way, of course, cross-validation, more cross-validation.
Michael Goujon. Thanks, Stéphane. A last question. What about the 55% of the variance in fatalities that your regressions cannot explain? What should be the factors that?
This is a great question. Okay. Basically, in this. It's come back with a discussion with Vincent and Robert and Natalia previously. It's been that thanks to this COVID-19 situation, we don't have background, we don't have experience. There is a lot of possible investigation, direction, pollution, environmental. There is some contradiction on result. I think we have to have maybe at more 2 or 3 years of data, and then to have more data collection to see which kind of variable we can add. And then talk about the uncertainty, okay? I think at the end, there is a part of uncertainty we will never can capture by some variable. Okay, it's like in financial market. We know that even if we are rational, we apply some classical financial methodology on strategy, humans are irrational, and they do something very strange. And it's a part of the work, and it's the only way to make business. So I think for COVID-19 would be like the same thing. Even if we put all possible variables at the end, there is some unexplained variance around the model. So I think the solution is, okay, try to find which ones are significant and assume that they not cover the full part of the situation. And of course, thank you, because if we think that, if we found that 95% of the situation is explained by my variables, research is finished. So I like that there's a part of the open investigation for sure.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Vincent, you could maybe say something about the Pooling project and opening the final questions, discussion for the last minutes.
Yes, thank you, Natalia. We have in the title of the seminar of today 2 or 3 words, like structural break and structural change. Well, this will be the subject of the next international conference that Tatiana will organize. Because as of today, after listening to the very interesting presentation of Robert and Stefan, it is clear that the question of structural break, the question of how to measure and how to think change in the long term, and the question of is the shock of COVID a game-changing shock, we have had today no answer to this question, clearly. And this is why we do have a very interesting and vast field of research for the future. And in this very vast field of research for the future, we have our research program focusing on the situation of small island economies and territories. Why this focus on why should it be interesting to understand and to analyze the impact of COVID? Because these small islands are at the same time highly vulnerable to shocks on a structural manner. And at the same time, they seem very resilient to disasters, climatic shocks in their history. So we do think that small island economies illustrate one of the main characteristic or question that we should analyze. The question of the role of institutions between vulnerability, exposure to shocks like the COVID, but also a large panel of different shocks, climatic shocks, etc. And the resilience. There are policies and institutions that play and had played a very important role as experienced by the history and the economic growth trajectories of those small island economies.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vincent. I don't know if we have some final remarks, suggestions, maybe opening further the debate to take home, work to take home, and to think about that for the next conference or even an international seminar or a conference. Christine, okay, so this here we have felicitations, but if there are no questions, I would like to say thank you, all of you, and particularly in special our excellent speakers today for your great research, and thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for the organization and animation of the conference. And thank you, Robert, and thank you, Stefan. Great job.
Okay, so we can say goodbye.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.